Let's talk about the ego. Not just any ego, but a man's ego. This isn't about arrogance or bravado. This is about the soft underbelly of his identity, the place where his sense of worth, validation, and masculine pride quietly reside. The part he won't speak about but reacts from. The ego is fragile, not because men are weak, but because most men are raised to anchor their self-worth in external achievements, status, control, desirability. So when a woman comes along who doesn't play into that, who doesn't rush to validate, who pauses before affirming, who doesn't immediately mirror his confidence back to him, something shifts inside him. He becomes unsure. And in that uncertainty, he becomes engaged. You don't need to attack his ego directly. That would make you the enemy. What you do instead is far more subtle and far more effective. You simply don't feed it. You observe him, you enjoy him, but you don't orbit around him. You don't become a reflection of what he wants to see. You become a mirror of what he isn't seeing in himself. And in that contrast, you plant a seed of desire. Not physical desire, existential desire. The desire to be seen, the desire to be chosen, not because he is impressive, but because he is deeply enough. When you withhold automatic validation, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, he starts asking himself questions. Why didn't she laugh at that joke the way others do? Why did she pause instead of complimenting me? Why doesn't she seem eager to please? These are not insults. These are micro-disruptions to his ego's default settings. And that's where obsession starts, not in admiration, but in ambiguity. You see, the male ego is conditioned to expect certain responses from women: praise, availability, emotional labor. When you gently disrupt that rhythm, he is forced to recalibrate. You are no longer a character in his story. You are writing your own. You're not punishing him. You're positioning yourself as someone who sees him beyond the surface. And this is what disturbs him in the best possible way. Because once a man senses you're not dazzled by his surface level appeal, his ego feels a fracture. And in that fracture, curiosity is born. And from that curiosity comes the chase. Not for you necessarily, but for the feeling of being enough for you. That's the secret. You hurt the ego just enough to make him question how to earn your affection. What's most important is the intention. This isn't about manipulation, it's about discernment. You're not wounding him, you're reminding him that your attention has value, that your energy is selective, that your presence is not a given. And the truth is, the men who respect you for this, who don't crumble, rage, or retaliate, those are the men with the capacity to grow, to reflect, to become obsessed in the way that doesn't consume you, but uplifts you. Because obsession, when born from ego disruption, isn't about control. It's about longing. It's about depth. It's about a man finally realizing that his usual moves don't work on a woman who knows herself. And that is unforgettable. You don't hurt his ego to break him. You hurt it just enough to awaken him. If the first disruption is subtle ego tension, the second is spatial, emotional space. The space where craving is born, not from punishment or games, but from the deliberate act of not overgiving. And this is difficult, especially for women taught to equate affection with performance. Be kind enough, warm enough, available enough, and maybe, just maybe, he'll see your worth. But what if I told you that this very instinct, while beautiful in its origin, is often what stifles desire? Desire is not born in proximity, it's born in distance. Not emotional coldness, but the kind of self-contained presence that refuses to collapse itself into someone else's time. Men do not become obsessed with what is constantly present, always reassuring, always proving. This is where memory gets sharpened, where his mind begins to rehearse what he took for granted. He starts to replay your words, your tone, your energy. Not because you yelled, not because you begged, but because you disappeared with dignity. And this is the part we must sit with. Emotional availability is valuable, yes, but it must be reciprocal. It must be met. If he's not showing up, you stepping in more only teaches him to do less. You compensate and he retreats. You give more and he receives passively. And slowly the polarity dies. The dance stops. He doesn't chase you. He leans back, comforted by your willingness to always be there. But when you create space, you interrupt this pattern. You signal something he's not used to seeing. A woman who will not bend for breadcrumbs. A woman who chooses herself, not as a tactic, but as a lifestyle. This is not coldness. This is self-respect. And it is magnetic. He may not realize it consciously at first, but on a deeper level, the masculine craves challenge, not in the sense of drama or chaos, but in the sense of a woman who doesn't make herself emotionally cheap. Men are obsessed with women who remain a little unpredictable, who can be soft one moment and completely unavailable the next, not as a manipulation, but as a result of having a life that doesn't revolve around him. The most intoxicating energy is when a man can't quite tell if he's won you yet, when he feels he's in a space of becoming, not just receiving. When your silence feels heavier than your presence ever did, not because you're punishing him, but because you've withdrawn your overfunctioning. And in that quiet space, he starts to miss the attention he once took for granted, not out of guilt, but out of loss. And loss is a powerful motivator. You don't need to make him chase, you just need to stop chasing. You stop over-explaining. You stop double-texting. You stop interpreting silence as a cue to perform. You sit in your energy. You let him notice. You let him feel. And this is how obsession begins. Not with noise, but with the space you leave behind. Let your absence teach him what your presence never could. Let's talk about mirroring. One of the most powerful, yet underrated, psychological tools in relational dynamics, and especially effective when you're dealing with masculine energy that has become complacent, inconsistent, or emotionally entitled. The principle is simple. Match his behavior, not his potential. Reflect what he gives, not what you hope he'll eventually offer. But here's what makes it profound. Most people don't mirror, they overcompensate. They explain, pursue, fix, especially when anxiety is triggered, especially when the connection starts to feel uncertain, and especially when he's pulling away. That's when the instinct kicks in, to lean forward, to clarify, to make things work. But what you're actually doing is teaching him that his emotional withdrawal will be met with more of you. More words, more presence, more tolerance. Mirroring flips that dynamic on its head. It says, I will not give you more than you're giving me. Not out of punishment, but out of emotional self-respect. If he goes quiet, you go quiet. If he slows down, you slow down. And not in an icy, passive-aggressive way, but with a kind of calm certainty that shows you're not afraid of space. You're not afraid to lose someone who isn't showing up. That in itself is an emotional confrontation for him. Because now, instead of being in control, he's being reflected. And the mirror never lies. It's not about ego. It's about equilibrium. Mirroring is what regulates power in the emotional exchange. And power in relationships is not about domination, it's about balance. When one person gives consistently more, the other gives less. It's human nature. But when a man is mirrored, gently, silently, he's forced to notice his own behavior. He doesn't hear a lecture. He doesn't receive criticism. He experiences the consequence of his actions in real time. Your absence, your silence, your neutrality. And that discomfort, it's where transformation begins. What you're doing here is creating a boundary without saying a word. You're not chasing him for emotional clarity. You're letting his inconsistency echo back to him. And for a man whose ego was once stroked by your attention, this shift is unsettling. He begins to question, why isn't she chasing me anymore? Why do I feel her pulling back? And here's where obsession starts to take root. Not because you played a game, but because you held up a mirror and let him sit with his own reflection. The deeper truth is this. Most men aren't used to emotional accountability from women. They're used to emotional labor. They're used to women filling in the emotional gaps, apologizing first, making peace, trying harder. So when you resist that impulse, when you meet silence with silence, distance with distance, it disrupts the dynamic entirely. Not because you're being cold, but because you're being congruent. That's power. And let's be honest. This kind of restraint requires maturity. It requires emotional regulation, because everything in you may want to fix things, to close the gap, to make the discomfort go away. But mirroring asks you to tolerate ambiguity, to trust that someone else's behavior is not your responsibility to correct, that his pullback is not an invitation for performance, but a signal for pause. And sometimes that pause is all it takes. Sometimes, when the mirror is clean and quiet, it's enough to make him return, not just physically, but emotionally aware. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped compensing for his lack. Let your silence be the lesson. Let your reflection be the catalyst. Because obsession doesn't begin when you explain your value. It begins when you quietly embody it. Now, let's bring it all together, because at the center of this isn't ego, space, or mirroring alone. It's you, the kind of woman you are, the kind of woman he cannot forget, the kind of woman who becomes his emotional upgrade, not by forcing change, but by being a catalyst for it. When a man meets a woman who operates from depth, who carries herself with quiet conviction, emotional intelligence, and boundaries that are lived rather than spoken, something fundamental shifts. He's no longer interacting with someone who needs him to feel whole. He's faced with someone who knows she's whole already. And for many men, that kind of presence doesn't fit into their old template of love. She's not reacting. She's not begging. She's not proving. She's requiring. And that requirement is never loud. It's never aggressive. It's not a demand for commitment or attention. It's simply this. If you want access to my softness, you must meet me with strength, emotional strength, not dominance. And for the man who's used to transactional validation, used to women performing for his attention, this is both disorienting and magnetic. You don't tell him what to do. You don't give him a checklist. You become the mirror of his potential. You model depth, presence, and discernment. And whether he realizes it or not, his subconscious begins to rise to meet you, or recoil if he's not ready. That's the beauty of this approach. It filters out what isn't aligned without a single You don't need to scream your standards, you embody them. That embodiment is the standard. And here's what's important. This doesn't make you hard or emotionally unavailable. In fact, it makes you rare. Because you're not here to punish him for not being enough. You're here to remind him of the version of himself he could become if he chose to rise. Not for you, but through you. There's a difference. Some women confuse obsession with control. But true obsession, the kind rooted in reverence, is born from recognition. He sees something in you he didn't know he was seeking. Not just beauty or charm, but meaning. You represent something larger, emotional depth, sovereignty, magnetism without performance. And suddenly, the dynamic is no longer about whether you like him. It becomes about whether he is enough for the world you've built within yourself. And that's when obsession turns inward. He starts to measure himself, not against other men, but against what it would take to stand beside a woman like you. And that internal striving, that inner reckoning, is where transformation happens. That's when you stop being just a romantic option and start becoming a personal standard. You're no longer the woman he dates. You're the woman he compares everyone else to, the one that quietly alters his view of love, of intimacy, of self-worth. And yes, he may fumble, he may pull away, he may wrestle with the gap between who he is and who he'd need to become. But he won't forget you, because you didn't just enter his life, you rearranged it. You introduced a level of emotional depth that can't be unlearned. And whether he steps into that space or not, he'll carry the echo of your presence. That's the kind of obsession that lingers, because in the end, you didn't chase him, flatter him, or beg him. You showed him what was possible and walked away when it wasn't met. You want to make a man obsessed? Don't become his fantasy. Become his awakening.